Dr. Dreger told us yesterday to only use relevant pictures, so I used a very relevant picture here. Yes, so we're talking about print culture and the War of 1812. And I don't know, in a way that can go with the sort of stuff I'm talking about, because, I mean, how do we commemorate the War of 1812? You can go to the fort and dress up as a soldier, and it's all fun and games, and not really a serious thing anymore. But that's more to do with the MRP and not with this presentation, so I won't talk about that. So what we're going to do is go over a bit of the general history of the newspaper, because I found it was kind of impossible to just start at 1812. You kind of have to have the backstory. And then look at a few examples of specific papers, some of which you read about, which are pretty interesting in terms of the biases that they show a lot of the time and the way that they covered the war. I think it shows a bit about what print culture was in America and Canada at that time. So the basic background on newspapers is they originated in 16th century Europe. Originally in Germany, but then later spreading to the Netherlands, Poland, France, and eventually England a little bit later. At that time, the printing press was not really a novel invention anymore, but they were still coming up with new things that you could print. So the creation of these newspapers was a pretty unique idea at the time. It was not really something that had been thought of immediately when the printing press came about. Originally, there were quite a few different formats, but what's known as the Couranto format, originating in the Netherlands, became the most common, which is what you see there. And I also actually have one here if you want to pass this around. This is much later. That's from 1847, but still in the original format that you would have seen in the 17th century, which by that time was pretty rare to actually see one like that. Basically, the format is they're made using 8 sheets of paper folded in half, so you get, or 4 sheets of paper folded in half, so you get 8 pages. They don't really have any sections. It's kind of just a big mass of stuff. There are no headlines. Headlines come around much, much later than this. Typically, the front cover would have, as you would expect, the name of the paper, often an illustration. That one doesn't. And other than that, it's basically just fit in whatever fits, wherever it fits. And commonly, they would have featured a wide variety of items from around the world. They didn't really have local papers yet. A major reason for that was that there was a lot of censorship, so printing news about your own country could get you in trouble. So it was preferable to print stuff from elsewhere that was basically selected for shock value a lot of the time, and your government wouldn't care if you were printing bad stuff about your neighbors, so it was okay. And typically they would have been published weekly at that time, roughly, although a lot of them kind of came out irregularly whenever they could. By the mid-19th century, that was when newspapers started to get bigger and look more like what we would imagine today. And but typically at that time, they were still featuring sort of the same weird mixtures of news. Having dedicated sections comes about a lot later, even than that. And the popularity of having a headline on the front page doesn't really happen until the end of the 19th century. So a lot of these developments are pretty recent and not things that you would have seen at the time of the war. One thing to add, as I said, they're not really thematically organized, but one thing that you would commonly find, and you will find on that one, is that on the back page there's a list of the prices of different commodities for the week. That's basically the only consistency that you can find in a lot of these papers, is that that was always included. And often that was the only locally relevant thing that you might find in a newspaper at that time. So a bit different in terms of how they were really used compared to nowadays, assuming that we still use newspapers nowadays, which a lot of us probably don't. This is a bit of a sort of off-topic thing, but Nowadays, newspapers are consistently polling as being the most trusted source of news, at least in the United States. Specifically, local newspapers have ranked at the highest for several decades now. It's been very consistent. And there's a belief among the general public that newspapers are pretty much the most neutral and unbiased source that you can find. There was a 1936 study by a guy named Mitchell Charnley, which found that about 50% of all newspaper articles actually had something wrong in them. And a more recent study in 2007, they found it was closer to 60%, which was the highest that had ever been found in those studies. But in spite of that, the public still trusts newspapers. And a lot of the major papers that are around really base their reputation on the idea that newspapers are a foundation of journalism and they're trustworthy. Back in this era, that really wasn't quite the same. A lot of these old newspapers are very openly biased, and that was what people expected to see. They wanted to read papers that were supporting the views that were popular in their local area. So there were no illusions about papers being neutral. It was quite obvious that they were reflecting the views of the publisher. Oftentimes the paper would be attributed to just one person, even though they're usually not actually just written by one person, but some of them were. But so you would know what side that person was on, and you would want to read their work for that reason. So, English newspapers. The British had been publishing newspapers for a long time, starting with the first news-related publications in the early 17th century, but the first thing that we would recognizably call a newspaper being in the 1660s. And one of the major reasons that it started at that time was that the English Civil War, which went from 1642 to 51, was driving demand for news material, and people wanted to read stuff that was supporting their chosen side. Newspapers became problematic for the government as a result of that. And so they were very heavily taxed, and they were also heavily censored. So the combination of those two factors meant it was not really a desirable business to be in. So there were not a lot of different newspapers. They basically had to be very big and have a large subscriber base in order to make any money. And they had to be lockstep with the government all the time, or else they would be targeted. So, you know, it takes a special kind of person to get involved in a thing like that. And again, most of them had very little domestic content. It was mostly world news and often just sensational stuff, not really anything that was of actual importance. And we can see a lot of those same qualities of the newspapers of the British colonies. This kind of thing lasted a surprisingly long time, into the mid-19th century, when sort of unlicensed and uncontrolled newspapers finally became more common in Britain. But even then, the idea of freedom of the press was not really in existence at that time. It was well known that the government sort of had control over these narratives. So it took a long time for publishers to really be able to get together and change that system. In the American colonies, the publishing of newspapers began in 1690 with a paper that was called Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic, which was shut down by the government after its first issue because they were not following the line. The British were enforcing the exact same taxation and censorship requirements that they would have at home. And because that paper was shut down, it took 14 years for somebody else to try it. And that time the Boston Newsletter got the official approval of the authorities and became the first American newspaper to actually be printed regularly. And from there the industry started to grow, but again, because of the taxation making it kind of unprofitable, there really weren't that many papers until after the Revolution, which kicked off a major change in the newspaper industry. After the Revolutionary War, the press in America didn't become more free, it just became split between the two parties that eventually arose, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, which are not related to the modern Republican or Democratic Party. Each side had control of a variety of newspapers, which were basically split along geographic lines, and they just used them to attack each other almost all the time. People wanted to see the political bias that they held reflected in their local papers. So again, everybody would have really been aware that there were Federalist papers and there were Democratic Republican papers, and they chose the one that was most suitable for them. Now, at the time when the War of 1812 began, this Federalist and Republican divide was still very strong in the American newspaper industry, and that would end up having a major impact on what they would write and report about the war. In 1812, there were approximately 370 newspapers which were operating in the United States, which is about twice as many as there were in Britain at the same time, despite Britain having twice the population. So that is a demonstration of the effects that the taxation really had on keeping the number of newspapers down in Britain and the colonies. The Federalist Party opposed the War of 1812, and the Democratic Republicans supported it. They were the ones that voted for it in the first place. So as a result of that, the Federalist papers were pretty much always reporting on the negative aspects of the war, writing articles about why America shouldn't be in the war in the first place, and attacking it often more on ideological grounds than actually anything about the cost of the war or the suffering or anything like that. In contrast to that, the Republican papers tended to actually avoid coverage of the war unless they were reporting on American victories. But they didn't really try to defend it or anything like that. There was less spin from them and more just kind of avoiding the stuff that they didn't want to print. During the times when the battles were not going well, what they typically did was they would focus more on individual accounts of what it was like to be in the battle, or they would also print a lot of government notices and military notices about the movements of troops and things like that, rather than actual news, which is not exclusive to those papers. All the papers were really filled with that stuff because they were, in effect, mouthpieces of the government, and they were required to print those notices. But you can tell sometimes that they were really filling up their pages with these notices because they didn't want to put anything else. And we'll see some examples of that in a bit, but I just want to cover first the Canadian side of it. So Canada got their first paper around 1752, so about 50 to 60 years after America. And many of the early Canadian newspaper publishers were American immigrants or European immigrants coming through America. So the industry was definitely influenced by that. The first one to actually launch in Canada was the Halifax Gazette from John Bushell, and the Canadian papers were again forced to follow the government rules just like in Britain, but sometimes they were actually even more restricted than back at home. A lot of the early publishers were really heavily targeted by the government whenever they printed anything that might be critical. Some of them were shut down, some of them were put in jail, and the colonial officials really interfered directly in their business. The Halifax Gazette ended up being an example of that because Bushell printed some articles that were critical of the government, and in response, the government made the provincial secretary of Nova Scotia the editor of his paper. And from then on, they basically kept anything critical out of the paper, which led to nobody reading it, and they went out of business. So they pretty much destroyed his enterprise there. The same sort of loophole about just reporting on foreign stuff was also in use in Canada a lot of the time. And it took until around 1800 for newspaper publishers to effectively rebel against this government control. And even then, a lot of them were still getting punished, and a lot of them suffered from doing this. But over time, they did create the free press institution that we have today. But that had not happened yet at the time of the War of 1812. And Also, something just to add to that, when I talk about printing foreign news in these papers, you have to keep in mind that they're getting the news a lot of the time from other newspapers. So it's not uncommon to see months-old news being printed in the papers, especially if it was coming from overseas, but sometimes even coming from within the country. It just depended on when they got their hands on it. The newspaper writers also really freely copied stuff from other papers, and sometimes from papers that were actually ideologically opposed to their own. They basically took anything that they wanted. There's no, not necessarily a concept of plagiarism yet at this time, because I don't think they were actually working together. I think they're basically just reading other newspapers and saying, oh, that looks good, we can put that in next week. So that was all considered pretty much fine to do. Now, at the time of the War of 1812, there were not many newspapers operating in Canada. There had been, according to historian Donald Hickey, there were a few dozen that were founded between 1752 and 1812, but only 7 or 8 were actually surviving in 1812. The majority having either been shut down or just not been able to stay in business because they weren't selling enough papers. And of those 7 or 8, only one of them actually manages to stay in print throughout the entire war, which is one of the ones that we're going to look at. So it was a very precarious business in Canada, more so than in the United States or even in Britain. And the Canadian papers a lot of the time avoided coverage of the war also. One of the obvious reasons for that being that there wasn't really room for any dissenting opinions on the war because it was just declared upon Canada. So there was no argument, no debate about it. And if there had been debate, then I'm sure the government would have shut down anybody who was debating it. But as a result of that, most of the coverage in the Canadian papers is strictly official government statements and military stuff. And also, when somebody notable was killed, they would do a write-up on their career and how sad it was that they were gone. That applies actually to leaders of both sides, and the American papers were doing the same thing. It wasn't uncommon to see them mourning the death of a Canadian in America or vice versa. Which is why some historians like to talk about 1812 as really being a war between brothers with a lot of sort of respect between the two countries, but not enough respect to stop them from killing each other. So kind of an odd situation. But that is pretty much that. So I'll look at a few examples of the papers, go through some of the content. Obviously, I'm not expecting you to read that. But that is the National Intelligencer, which was published out of Washington by a guy named Samuel Harrison Smith, who was a supporter of the Democratic Republicans. Founded in 1800 and published 3 times a week, which was pretty rare at that time. They had over 6,000 subscribers at their best, which was made it one of the largest newspapers in the United States at that time. It was one of the most respected papers of that era. They were known for good journalistic practices and pretty intellectual level of writing, although they were definitely not neutral. Samuel Harrison Smith was actually a pretty close friend of Thomas Jefferson and a very dedicated supporter of him. And in 1810, he handed over the paper to Joseph Gales and William Seton, who also had a lot of friends in the Democratic Republican government and actually were the official printers to that government. So it was very much tied up in the Democratic Republican Party. After the era of good feelings kind of changes the political landscape, which I'm not going to get deep into. They lost their official support from the government, but they then aligned with the Whig Party, and in the years leading up to the Civil War, turned this into a pro-union paper. So they always had a side, they just had to sort of change with the times. The 2 owners, Gales died in 1860 and Seton retired in 1864. The Civil War basically destroyed their operation, and it changed hands a few more times and then finally expired in 1870. So it was one of the longest lasting newspapers at the time, actually. It was a pretty impressive lifespan for one of these. Regarding 1812, they supported the government and they did support the war, but they were not overly enthusiastic about it. They were one of the more neutral papers in terms of the style of the authorship. Their printing offices were actually damaged when the British burned Washington in 1814. But unfortunately, there's no issues from that period that seem to be surviving. I would have loved to know what they had to say about that once they got back in business, but unfortunately, we don't know. This particular one that's on the screen is from during the war, but there was not a lot of talk about the war actually in it. A lot of the stuff that they printed in the Intelligencer was reports of government meetings, sort of minutes and things like that. So a lot of it is very dry, and there's not really any room for them to take a side. They kind of report on the arguments for and against that were being made, and you can do what you want with that information, more or less. So pretty interesting and pretty unique for that time. And there's the American Mercury, which was out of Hartford, Connecticut, another one of the most popular Democratic Republican papers, specifically supporters of Jefferson, who at the time was not in power anymore, but still had a fan base, sort of. This one was founded in 1784 and lasted until 1833. And the founders, their names are Elijah Babcock and Joel Barlow. The paper actually outlived both of them, which again was something that was very rare to see at the time, because a lot of these papers were pretty much one or two man operations and often would disappear if the owners died or moved. So the fact that it continued showed how big it had become. During the War of 1812, they pretty much avoided opinion coverage, again, as was common with that party's papers. A lot of their coverage of the war came directly from other papers, and they rarely wrote anything themselves that was on that topic. But one interesting thing about it is that they had a lot of advertisements in this paper, more so than many of the others at the time. And during the war, a lot of those advertisements were offering rewards for the capture of deserters. So it kind of tells you a little bit about what kind of people they expected to be reading it, that they would be supporters of the war. They would not be on the side of anybody who was trying to get away from the fight. You can actually see at the bottom there, they're selling tickets to the Washington Bridge Lottery. People are kind of surprised a lot of the time that a lot of the newspapers back then had advertisements on the front page. Sometimes that was what the entire front page was. It was the classifieds. So that's another change that's happened over the years, that they kind of got moved to the back. But once upon a time, the newspaper was really a community message board as well. So that stuff was considered very important in contrast to the actual news, which, again, not being from your area was kind of secondary. Another one is the Connecticut Mirror, which is one of the Federalist-backed papers. The publishers are Hale and Hosmer. There's nothing more that's really known about them, aside from the fact that they had a lot of connections to booksellers and publishers in the state of Connecticut, so they were most likely printing all kinds of material and not just the paper. The War of 1812 was very unpopular in Connecticut in general, and this paper in particular was really one of the leading voices against it at the time. And they published pieces showing a lot of the stances that they became very influential in anti-1812 writing. Even continuing today, a lot of American authors are still using some of these same arguments. They don't originate with this paper, but they can be found very easily in it. One of those major arguments was that basically Madison's government lied about the reasons for declaring war. They had some kind of ulterior motive. Another one was that any American losses were caused by basically incompetence of the American leadership, which is very common. You'll see that even in books today. and also a lot of just personal attacks on the character of Madison, Jefferson, and basically everybody else. That kind of material was very common in all the Federalist papers. They were a lot more vicious than the Democratic Republicans, and you saw some of that in Rudenko's article as well, and in some of the other papers. And this sort of thing was very eagerly read by supporters of the Federalist Party. They loved to see, these criticisms of the other side. This paper lasted until 1833, and then merged with two other nearby papers, the Independent Press and, surprisingly, the American Mercury, which was opposed to them. So that, I think, kind of speaks to the fact that even though these newspapers are on different sides, they're also part of the same business. So they're not really as big enemies as they might appear, much like you might say about today's news organizations. And after the merger, they only lasted for a couple more years. So evidently something was going wrong in the newspaper business in Connecticut at that time. But nobody's written anything about it yet, so I don't know what it was. And then there's this guy. Samuel Woodworth is his name. He was a poet and a publisher who lived in New York. He's best known for the poem The Old Oaken Bucket, which years after his death became a popular song in the early days of the reporting industry. But back in 1812, when the war was still fresh, he had the idea of making a newspaper that would only be dedicated to coverage of the war. And since he was a very creative writer, he came up with a very creative name for this paper, The War. Published from June 1812 until September 1814. And he got his information using a pretty interesting strategy, which was to rely on both American and Canadian and British papers, and also official government releases from both sides of the war. So it became known for being very surprisingly neutral and very factual in its reporting. There's really no opinion pieces that you would find in this paper. It's all very direct reporting on the events of the war. And judging by how many issues actually survive in collections, it must have been pretty popular at the time. So nowadays you see this kind of thing with magazines and that. You'll see special issues for different events and whatnot. But at the time it was a pretty unique idea to actually do something like this. And I'm not sure, it may be the earliest example of that sort of thing. I'm not entirely sure about that. But like the other papers though, they were publishing weekly with a few minor interruptions, but a lot of the reporting was pretty delayed based on how long it took for the information to come. So even though it was very fact-based, it was not necessarily up-to-date all the time. There was actually another New York paper that had the same idea of being just dedicated to the war, the Military Monitor and American Register, which was credited to Thomas O'Connor, as you can see, who was an Irish Catholic immigrant, well-known at the time historian of the United States and frequent creator of newspapers in general. He launched quite a few. Even though it was credited just to him, they actually had quite a number of different writers who have been discovered over the years, many of whom were tied to the American Antiquarian Society, which was launched in 1812. So there was, it was quite a big operation and had a lot of well-known scholars and historians of the time who were writing for it anonymously. This one also lasted from 1812 to 1814, and just like the war, it was drawing on a wide variety of sources from all sides, making it relatively balanced. After the war ended, Thomas O'Connor wrote a book about the War of 1812, and then he later launched the specifically Irish Catholic newspaper called the Shamrock, which was the first of its kind in the United States and was much more personal, had a lot of his own opinions in it, whereas this one didn't. So again, kind of showing that there's demand for different kinds of papers at the time. You could have these fact-based ones, and you could have more sort of ideological ones that were coexisting. And then to look at a Canadian paper, there is the Kingston Gazette, which was launched by a guy named Nahum Moore in 1810, sorry. And he was one of the more interesting newspaper figures in Canada, although he hasn't been researched as much as he probably deserves to be. He was actually born in Vermont in the United States, and he moved to Montreal in 1807 along with his apprentice at the time, who was named Stephen Miles. In Montreal, he launched two different papers, the Canadian Current and the Montreal Advertiser, which were both fairly successful. But in summer of 1810, they decided to move to Kingston and launch the Kingston Gazette. It's kind of a long story, but Moore hands over the paper completely to the apprentice, Stephen Miles, and his former printer, Charles Kendall. But Moore stays involved with the paper behind the scenes all the way up until his death in 1830. Meanwhile, Miles left in 1811 because his apprenticeship was up. He was finally of age, and he went back to Montreal. Kendall sold the paper to a corporation of investors who then immediately contacted Miles asking him to come back and sold it back to him. And he then became the head guy. But unfortunately, being so young, when the War of 1812 broke out, he had to enlist. And surprisingly, he managed to keep the paper in print throughout his time being a soldier, and often actually printed a lot of first-hand accounts of the battles, which may have been written by himself. So it was pretty interesting circumstances that happened there. Like most of the other Canadian papers, the Gazette didn't really take a stance on the war other than to obviously support the Canadian side. But you're not going to find a lot of opinion pieces in this one. And in terms of the later years, Miles sold the paper in 1833 and gave up the printing business entirely a couple of years later and became a Methodist preacher, which he was until he died in 1870. So these few people had a really major impact on the development of the newspaper industry in Canada. But the sort of the twists and turns that happened in the story of this paper, I think, have kept anybody from really researching them in the depth that they probably deserve. The paper that's actually pictured here is the first issue that had any war-related content. And from that, you can see an example of the delays because the war was declared on June 18th. This paper is from July 14th and is reporting on the declaration of war. So I'm not sure if people would actually have known about the war prior to the paper coming out. I mean, you'd think that the newspapers would have got information probably faster than your average Joe, but it's hard to imagine that there could be a war on for a month and you wouldn't have heard about it. But anyway, as usual, on the right-hand side there, the congressional record with the declaration in it is just printed verbatim with no commentary or anything like that. There was, however, an editorial that did appear in this issue, which was anonymous, as they usually were, accusing America of being a tyrannical sort of state and saying that living under the Constitution of Great Britain is a great blessing that everybody should be thankful for. So there was room for some opinion, as long as it was obviously the opinion that the Canadian government would have supported. I looked through a lot of issues of this one, and they all pretty much follow the same pattern, where they're mostly taken up by official reports, notices, and things like that, and very rarely an editorial that would obviously favor the Canadians. Unfortunately, the issues that are from right when the war ended don't seem to survive, but I found that just a few months after the official end of the war, the paper was again reprinting poetry and other content from American papers, just as they had done before the war, but they stopped during. So it seems that there weren't really any hard feelings within the newspaper business, at least. They pretty much went back to being colleagues afterward. And all of that, I think, suggests that the publishers of this paper, and probably a lot of other Canadian papers, were more interested in just running a profitable and legal business than in actually trying to convince you of anything. I don't think they really would have considered that to be their purpose in the way that the Americans perhaps did. I wanted to talk a bit about pamphlets because they're related to the newspaper business in terms of being another inexpensive, disposable, and up-to-date form of media that existed at this time. The authors had a bit more freedom to express themselves than they would have if they were writing for the papers, although still not much by our standards. You did have to be careful about what you published in these pamphlets. But in general, you can find some more interesting material in these than you can in the papers. I'm not going to go too deep into these. This one looks like garbage because it's on microfilm, but
Are you reading this?
well, luckily most of the pages look better than that, but they did a really poor job on the title page. But that is one of the few Canadian pamphlets that I've been able to find. It's a sermon occasioned by the death of Major General Brock, published in 1812, and notable because it was printed by Nahum Mower of the Gazette, which showed that in spite of the relative neutrality of his paper, he did print some more opinionated stuff, such as this. The sermon was by the Reverend William Smart, and focuses pretty heavily on the fact that America basically was now experiencing the level of bloodshed that Europe was already used to, and kind of that they deserve it. It was about time. And that the Americans could really only blame themselves for making it happen. Of course, Brock is depicted as being a fallen hero of the British Empire, just as he is today in almost everything that's ever been written about him. And only at the end does it really come around to being a sermon, because they liken the defeat of America to God's defeat of Satan, which is a little extreme. And of course, keeping in mind that America had not actually been defeated, because this was only in 1812, so the war was not by any means over, but the Reverend was pretty confident that they were going to, the British were going to come out ahead by the end of the war. But the interesting piece. And it opens up with kind of an interesting statement about sort of an apology, which is pretty common to see in a lot of these pamphlets, saying basically that we know there's a lot of great sermons that deserve to be printed, but we're only printing this one because it's really relevant right now. But don't assume that this one is like special and all the other ones aren't. So, yeah, I always liked reading that sort of thing. In terms of how much 1812 pamphlets were being printed in Canada, it seems not very many. This one, there are a few different references to it being in collections, so it may have, again, sold pretty well. Or it could just be total coincidence that this one survived and other ones didn't. But I think at least some of it, again, is related to the fact that there's not any room for debate over the War of 1812. I mean, a Canadian writer is not going to come out and say that they support the war, you know. So what are you really going to write in a pamphlet? On the American side, there's much more room to argue your position. As people like this author did. Why Are We Still at War? Or The American Question, by the Conciliator, which anonymous, and as you can see, no publisher information, no nothing. This one is most interesting because it talks a bit about the idea of press freedom, which you might get from the subtitle, where they say a series of essays rejected by the journalists as unpopular. They go into a bit more detail about that, basically saying that the author says he offered these essays to a lot of different newspapers, but they got rejected by everybody. Some of the editors said that they didn't fit the spirit of their papers, so basically admitting that they were biased, whereas others said that they didn't want to deal with the consequences of printing this sort of material, admitting that they're being censored. So you see a real insight into how the journalism business worked at this time, which I think is pretty unusual for somebody to comment on it so directly while it was going on. Now, whether or not it's actually true that they were offered to the newspapers, who knows? That could just be part of the argument. But I think the spirit of it certainly is true. And they are pretty fiery essays, so I can imagine that the editors would not have wanted to print them. Obviously, it's anti-war, as you might expect. It's not quite actually as harsh as I would have expected. Mostly, the main argument is that the government's stated reasons for declaring the war were not serious enough complaints to actually warrant declaring a war. That's the main argument of it. So they stay away from the personal attacks and things like that, at least. There's also this one, The Road to Peace, which is also from 1813 and credited to an old farmer and written, again, with that sort of humble tone of, I'm not an expert. I don't know anything. I just don't think the war is right, In terms of the arguments, it's very similar to the last one. Basically, the reason why I wanted to show this one is that it shows a contrast to the way that newspapers were and are written. Because in the paper, you expect to read something, even if it's heavily biased, it's written as though it is the straight facts. Whereas in these pamphlets, you get much more of a personal tone. Although often, obviously, an exaggerated and possibly entirely made up persona, but still being told to you as if it's the opinion of one person. So it's a different style of presentation that it might serve to convince you in a different way than the newspapers might. But again, basically just arguing that all these complaints were really not that serious and they shouldn't have gone to war over things like that. And then lastly, there's a very interesting one called The Wars of the Gulls, which is a Federalist-supported pamphlet. Basically, it's in the form of a parable where the gulls declare war on their neighbors for basically pointless reason. They think it's just going to be an easy win for them, and instead they get defeated. And the reference to going forth to play the game of Holgo in Upper Canada is a reference to General William Hull, who surrendered Fort Detroit to the British in 1812. So that was one of the first events of the War of 1812 that really showed it was not going well for the Americans right off the bat, and inspired the writing of this piece and others. It was published anonymously. However, it's known to have been written by two men, Jacob Bigelow, who was a very well-known scholar and medical doctor and botanist of the time, and Nathan Hale, who was a pretty successful journalist and publisher and supporter of the early industrialists. Both of them were really diehard Federalists who were absolutely against the war. And I imagine they published it anonymously because they didn't want to jeopardize their successful careers in other areas. But I'm not exactly sure how it has come to be attributed to them, but it's pretty universally credited to those two, so it is well known for that. The idea of using a satirical kind of form like this was pretty common in the pamphlets, made them a little more easier to get by censorship when that was necessary, but also more fun to read than a pretty dry argument against the war. So they were popularly used. This was reprinted in 1890, again out of New York, by a historical society that operated in that area. So I'm not sure if that was politically connected or if they just wanted to, reprint this old rare piece, but that's one of the reasons why it's fairly easy to find on the internet today. And that is that.